Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I am very, very honored to be joined once again by H.G. Tudor, who is the foremost authority on both narcissism and psychopathy, as he is a diagnosed and self-aware narcissistic psychopath. And we have in the past had a discussion about narcissism, which I thought was very illuminating on so many different levels, which is why I wanted to have another interview with HG and discuss this time psychopathy. So thank you very much, HG, for joining us once again.
My pleasure to be here, Faye. Thank you for inviting me onto your program.
Thank you. And prior to starting the recording, HG and I were actually just discussing a little bit about the creative process he has. Because as many of my viewers know from subscribing to your channel and taking in your content, you are a very prolific producer of content. And I think I think I had actually heard you say in one of your videos you have over 5,000 videos now. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
That is remarkable. So first and foremost, I know that you have a very popular blog. And the way that I actually had found you was through your blog. And then I had seen that you had a YouTube channel and I was floored. So can you speak a little bit in terms of the amount of time that you put into the creation of your content, both of your blog and on your YouTube channel?
Certainly. Perhaps if I provide a bit of a potted history, Faye, that'll give some context. So nearly 8 years ago, I started the blog. And prior to that, I had spent some time writing about the way that I saw the world, just sort of jottings, for want of a better description. And I had put these thoughts down about the world, the way that I see the world, the way that observations about others of my kind. So there was this hodgepodge of material that had existed, and I didn't really do anything with it. And I then created the blog to help people understand how does the mind of a narcissist function, and how does the narcissist see the world? So I called it Knowing the Narcissist. So there's a sort of slight alliteration to the title, and it did what it said on the tin, so to speak. So at first it was just explaining the way that I would see things, and I would utilize a combination of the existing work that had been around for some years and combined it with newer material. And so I would provide material nearly every day to begin with, subject to my other commitments. And then around about February 2016, I created the first YouTube channel and put up a couple of videos there. And I wanted to create material that was new, i.e. that people hadn't seen on the blog. And around this time, I'd also been writing various books, sometimes producing 2 or 3 a week. So there was this body of work that was being built up. And then with the new YouTube channel, I didn't really do anything with it until later that year, where I thought, well, actually, some people prefer to receive their content in reading it. Others prefer to watch and listen to it. So rather than necessarily create fresh content for that YouTube channel, I decided I would just utilize the existing body of blog work and narrate those articles and include them. So I started to do that. And that old YouTube channel, I was sporadic with regard to what I would upload there. So I might go through a process of 3 or 4 videos a day for a few weeks and then nothing for a few weeks because I had other commitments. And I wasn't writing as much in terms of books after this period of time. And there were still blog articles that were being created. And then I created a new channel in October 2020, which is the current YouTube channel that everybody knows, and decided to re-record some of the existing material. Reason being is when I'd done it the first time, I was often traveling and the microphone wasn't that good on the laptop that I'd used. Therefore, the sound quality wasn't as good as it could have been. So I improved that, and then there was new material and so forth. And essentially, there are so many different strands to the work. That's why I have such a large body of material that I'm able to share. And I have a tremendous work ethic. So essentially what I tend to do is I rise around about 5 a.m., exercise, then I shower, breakfast, etc. And then I attend to whatever professional matters might have arisen overnight, deal with those. And then probably around about mid-morning, I turn my attention to what I call blog world. And I may attend to various emails and then look at what material might be included in the day's videos if I have time allocated to create them. And I prefer to create videos on a near daily basis to maintain that presence and the expectation from people about material, and to look at continuing to extend my reach. I have some frustration with YouTube and the way that it works. Indeed, I had a conversation with one of their employees only earlier this week, but that's an observation for another occasion. But part of the prodigious output of material is that people clearly enjoy my work. They want more of it. I want to ensure that there's this huge body of work so that other people can access it. And it builds up this legacy of material that will live on years after I've shuffled off this mortal coil, which is some way off, but nevertheless, it's there. So I want this huge library of work. And because there are various strands to it, Faye, this means there's a huge amount to talk about. So for example, if you break some of it down, I tell you about the different types of narcissists and the way that they function and interact. So I tell you about the way that a middle lesser might behave, or a middle range type A, or a lower grey type. So you have all of that. I then talk about the different empaths. I talk about the vulnerabilities of the empath. I talk about all the different manipulations, of which there are hundreds. I then talk about the dynamic between the narcissist and the empath. I talk about other categorizations of people. I give practical information about how you can deal with a narcissist in certain situations. So already there's 7 heads of topic that I've just rattled off the top of my head. Then you can include the aspects of psychopathy, which we're going to talk about later. Talk about the way the psychopath sees the world, talk about the differences, that's a work in progress, between a pure narcissist, a narcissistic psychopath, which is I, and a pure psychopath. And then, of course, there are the popular materials about famous and infamous people. So you have all the various series, so series about Boris Johnson and Vladimir Putin and Ben Affleck and Jada Pinkett Smith, Amber Heard, and so on and so forth. So lots of different famous and infamous people that I've covered, including Harry's wife as well, where she's very popular. And so what I do is there are distinct audiences, because on top of all of that material, there's me. Because there are also many people who are interested in what I say, because I've spent years observing both victims and perpetrators. So that's why I'm able to sort of enable you to get inside the head of different types of narcissists, because they're in my family. Some of them are my lieutenants. I've worked with them. Some are in my friendship groups. And so by interacting with them, manipulating them, understanding the way that they tick, I can then share that information. But then there's everything about me. So there's my life, snippets of which I've shared in the Knowing HG series, which you can obtain in the Knowledge Vault. I provide aspects of my worldview in some of the articles about narcissists. Others are written from the worldview of different types of narcissists. I've given bits and pieces of my family history. I've given glimpses of, for instance, my interactions with former intimate partner primary sources. both in standalone articles and the Asylum with the Grotesque series. So I think I've probably mentioned at least 20 different heads of work there. And there's still a lot more for me to talk about. So the reason that I create so much is to generate a presence, make a mark on the internet, so to speak, so that my work can be found. But also it's a vast topic in terms of narcissists, psychopaths, empaths, other types of victim, practical tips, my world, my viewpoint, my history, my relationships, my family. So there's a huge amount. And in some of those areas, I've only shared a little bit so far. And I like to write, but the fact is I have certain constraints upon my time because I have a private and professional life alongside, as I mentioned, blog world and everything that that encompasses. And in some respects, I contemplate that I might take a sabbatical, and in effect, there's no content for a period of time. I don't undertake any consultations, etc., so that I can finish off some of the books that I've started. But the fact remains, in practical terms, I can sit down, and a lot of the videos that I create, I just do off the top of my head. So I just start talking about the topic, or I may jot down a few notes about it. But if I was to sit and write a blog article, it would probably take me about an hour. I can do 4 or 5 videos in that time. So when there's a constraint upon my time, it's a bit of a no-brainer really in terms of what I create, whereby it's easier for me to sit down and create 4 or 5 videos. What I try to do is ensure that the interest groups that I have in my work are catered for. There are many of my viewers who are solely interested in Harry's wife, and that's all they're bothered about. Some of those people are also interested in narcissism, but there's a lot of them who just want to know the latest tittle-tattle about Harry's wife, seen through the lens of narcissism, and find out, you know, if that ship has sunk yet, because they're wanting to watch that happen. And then there is perhaps what I call a more purist audience that are interested in the narcissism, and they might have a slight interest in Harry's wife, or some of them actually don't like that work. They prefer for me to talk about either other people or other aspects about narcissism. And so I look to cater to both of those tastes because they're both important in different ways. Harry's wife reaches a lot of people, which means the channel becomes more prominent. But it's almost that sort of like the tabloid style of things. And then the other side of it is a little more highbrow in going into the detail of all about it. And that's not necessarily as well viewed, unfortunately, as the Harry's wife material, but is just as, or rather is important for different reasons. So I look to deal with both of those. And in terms of video production, I look at creating anywhere between 6 to 10 videos each day. The only help that I receive with the videos is that I have a graphic designer who I brief on what I want, and he creates the thumbnails for me, then sends them back. But sometimes he's not available, so I have to do them myself. But in terms of the actual narration and the creation, that's all done by me, usually just by me sitting down in front of the microphone and speaking, either off the cuff or occasionally by utilization with some notes. And hitherto, of course, I was narrating existing work. So where I've written, so the series about psychopathy that I've been creating as of late, what has happened there is I have been writing those pieces, and in writing those pieces, I have then narrated them thereafter for the video. And then on top of that, of course, there's the creation of material to go in the knowledge vault, where I might create a new product. That happens from time to time. And around all of that, I attend to audio consultations and undertaking the detectors and so on and so forth. And basically, my day alternates between doing blog world and professional work because I have a variety of different interests. Occasionally, blog world goes quiet because I'm in the field, so to speak, with what I do professionally, or I'll be doing other personal things. But because I'm not doing as much of the professional work as I once did, that gives me more time to create the content. And I've been considering whether I'm going to utilize a sort of staff with all of that now to increase the output so that I can delegate some of the more administrative tasks that exist and the marketing tasks that exist, so that I can focus more on the content creation and build up that body of work by releasing more books, releasing more series of videos, more material for the knowledge vault. So there's quite a lot of ideas that are in my little black book that are there ready to be unleashed upon the world. So that's a little bit of insight into what I do by way of content creation.
I think it's remarkable that first and foremost, I mean, it's a testament to how much you really know about, and I think at this point, I don't think there's any doubt that you know exactly what you're speaking of, but it's really a testament to that you are able to just sit down and go completely off the cuff, maybe with a little bit of notes, maybe just speaking whatever is in your mind at that time. It's rather remarkable that you're actually able to do that and create, as you had shared, between 6 and 10 videos a day. And I think in the last interview, you had said you're like a one-man operation. Now you have your graphic designer, but it's just kind of remarkable to think how much you're able to get done in the span of a day. And so you said you wake up at 5 a.m., right?
Yes.
And then you start working it. So do you feel like, I know you had referred to in one of your videos, your mother as the matronarch, right? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Do you feel like the work ethic you have is because of your upbringing and because of the fact that you have you were raised by a matronarch?
I think there's an element of that in I was always having to prove myself. So the lack of control environment that I was exposed to was that I was physically and sexually abused as a child, but also what I was subjected to what I call grade B syndrome, which is you scored 2 goals, why didn't you score 3? You got 80% in your examination, why didn't you get 90%? So whatever I did was not good enough. And therefore, rather than down tools and think, hey ho, well, that's that, my response to that was, I'll show you. I'll get 90% next time. I will score 3 goals next time. I've climbed that hill, there's another hill. Okay, I'll climb that next hill as well. So that was somewhat indoctrinated into me as a child, that one always has to strive. Family mottos, Victoria or Mort, victory or death, which it basically sums up the attitude of my family to life. And I have had that imbued into me, but also a lot of it stems from what I am. My narcissism requires recognition. Hard work and achievement brings the recognition that I require, alongside, of course, my machinations with playing with people. But the fact is that by being an achiever, I've always been a high achiever. I achieve in what I do professionally. In the blog I do with the output, that provides fuel for me. Furthermore, with my psychopathy, I'm very focused, and it's something that I endeavor to ensure that my clients that I assist with their issues understand about logic-based decision-making, not being misled by emotions, and focusing on what delivers. I don't engage in things that are redundant. So, for example, I will deal with an email once and that's it. I don't look at it and think, oh, I'll deal with that later. So I have a precursory glance, and the way that it's set up is that certain emails are prioritized so that I will deal with those first, and then others are followed up on later on. But I don't open an email, read it, and then go, oh, well, I'll deal with that later. So I categorize them in the way that they come into my inbox in the first place, so that there isn't a duplication of effort. So that's just one example of that. I'm not distracted, so I don't feel the need to suddenly stand by a water cooler and have a discussion about last night's television. If there is scope for having a conversation with somebody along those lines, I will have it. But a lot of the time, I don't need to. And of course, much of the time, when I'm dealing, of course, with Blog World, I'm on my own. Yes, I have communications with people electronically, but I'm not sat in an office with other people, so I'm free of distraction also. And the hyper-focus that I have from my psychopathy, and the fact that I function almost in a sort of machine-like way of, I don't stare out of the window daydreaming like some people perhaps might do. I don't suddenly think, oh, look, there's an interesting news article, and then get distracted and start reading that rather than focusing on what I ought to be doing. Or, oh, I'll have 15 minutes on SimCity because this is a difficult thing that needs to be doing, and it's easier to go and play SimCity than get on with what you need to do. I have a very clear objective each day as to what it is that is to be achieved that day, and I get on and I do it. And because I am not distracted by an emotional level or emotional spectrum that other people are, that I don't function with an emotional thinking, that I stay on focus with what needs to be done, that enables me to create and achieve a lot in a day. I think if people actually examined how much time they spent undertaking their work as compared to standing around and having a chat with somebody, and I understand entirely that that's what oils the wheels of people's existences, and they build friendships and so forth. I don't function that way, so it's different for me. So they will say, well, you know, they may have a different existence where they've got these different friendships that they service and so forth. Fair enough, but they're not getting on with what they need to do, and people faff. You know, they get distracted by things, and if they were to have somebody do a time and motion study, I think they'd be quite horrified actually at how much time they spend not doing what they should be doing, and no wonder they get to the end of the day and think, I don't really feel like I've done much today. But that's because you've been too busy faffing about with things rather than getting on with it. But the way that I am, because of my narcissism and my psychopathy, very much lends itself to considerable output. So it's advantageous for me.
Because you mentioned TV, do you actually watch TV? Do you read books? Do you engage in very basic extracurricular activities? Or are you very singularly focused with how you spend your time and who you interact with?
I have all popular television, news stories and books all assimilated into a chip which goes into the back of my head. And then I have all of that information automatically available. No, I read books, not as much as I once did, but I do. I'm not reading anything at the moment. What I tend to do is I read a lot of news material because that's pertinent to some extent. There's a topicality that can be found there that's used in Blog World. You know, I might come across an interesting news story about a narcissist, which I can then create a video from to explain to people this shows various facets of narcissism. There might be a development with a famous person who I've covered before that pops up in the news, so I can use that. But I read, for example, Spectator, The Economist. I take my news from the Times, from the Daily Telegraph, from the Guardian. I utilize Africa News, France 24, Forbes, various other news outlets, both in terms of broadcast news, but particularly digital and print media, because that's very pertinent to what I do professionally for me to keep on top of what's going on around the world. So there's a reasonable amount of time that's spent digesting that information. I do watch television, not all of the time. Some days will go by where I don't watch it at all. I tend only to watch sport and news live. I don't watch anything else. And so if I do watch television, it'll be for a series or a film via streaming or having, purchased it on Amazon Prime, etc. I don't slump in front of BBC One of an evening and watch their scheduled output. I don't have time to do that. But a lot of the time I'm doing other things. So I'm out and about dealing with people. spending time with people, attending to other things that I do professionally and personally, so that I don't have time to sit and watch television every day. So I do those things, but I am busy with other matters as well.
Fair enough. I can appreciate that. And I know that, so first and foremost, one of the series, your new series that I've been binge watching is your new series on psychopathy. And
Yes.
that's kind of what had inspired me to want to talk about psychopathy today. So first and foremost, for anyone who has not seen it yet, it's incredibly chilling. A lot of it has to do first and foremost with your delivery. And it seems like and correct me if I'm mistaken, but it actually even seems like you're almost like delighting in the delivery of it to make it as chilling as possible. And if that's the case, it is working remarkably well. It's incredibly chilling, but it's giving us, I think, the viewers, a different take and a different perspective, getting inside the mind of HG. And I would love it if you could speak a little bit about psychopathy and how it varies, or what are the differences between psychopathy and narcissism. And then I guess after that, we can kind of talk about like the overlay of what it means to be a narcissistic psychopath.
I'm creating material which addresses the similarities and differences between all three. So I don't want to reveal too much of that to take away from that material. So that work addresses the pure narcissist. Now, a lot of the material that exists already is about narcissism. And the reason is there are more narcissists than there are psychopaths. Most people, if they have come into an abuse situation, will have been dealing with the narcissist rather than the psychopath. So that's why a lot of the material in the books and also in the videos is about narcissism. So you have the pure narcissist that has to seek the prime aims: fuel, control, character traits, and residual benefits. And the pure narcissist, of course, control and fuel are very important to them. And the pure narcissist has considerable fuel needs. You then have the pure psychopath. Psychopaths don't need fuel. Psychopaths have to fight against the boredom that exists. And you have low functioning psychopaths, the ones that usually end up in prison. They have considerable difficulties controlling their impulses. You have your high functioning psychopaths who won't kill anybody. And these are the ones that end up in the boardroom, that are surgeons, that are lawyers, etc., often high achievers. And then you have the narcissistic psychopath, which is a hybrid, which is what I am. And so I need fuel, but not as much as a pure narcissist. I don't experience fear in the way that a narcissist does. So narcissists experience anxiety when fuel's dropping, for instance. When they face a threat to control, they will experience fear as a consequence of a threat to control as well. So it's a mechanism, and that fear motivates them to seek that control. Either, for instance, let's say somebody's attacking them, that's a threat to control, so they will fight back, or they'll run away, and running away is asserting control through withdrawal. So they have the difference in that respect. The psychopath is hyper-focused. The narcissist tends to be more haphazard in the way that they deal with things, because when it comes to lesser and mid-range narcissists in particular, they function in the moment, whereas the psychopath is more likely to be involved in planning ahead compared to the narcissist. So those are just a few of the similarities and differences that exist in those groupings. But as I've mentioned, there's a larger body of work, so I don't want to sort of spoil taking away from that. Now, Thank you for your compliments about the psychopathy work. I appreciate those. And the idea is, if you identified, Faye, is to enable people to get into that mindset and to focus purely on the psychopathic aspect of my life, which is far more cold and detached. So the psychopath has a very limited emotional spectrum. Mine's a little bit bigger because of the input of my narcissism, but it isn't that large nevertheless. And what I seek to convey to help people understand is that with the psychopathy, it isn't about thinking, oh, I want to get a chainsaw and chase somebody through a hotel corridor and then murder them a la Patrick Bateman, but rather to get people to understand that there is this completely different mindset and worldview that I have, and I want people to understand what that's like. And for some people, it will be uncomfortable because it's alien to them, because it's very much stripped, for the most part, of emotion. It's very cold and clinical and logical. But also, much of what I explain is very analytical about the way that I regard people and relationships and interactions, and that everything is there to be utilized towards the psychopathic aim, which essentially is about deriving enjoyment from playing games with people in order to alleviate the all-pervasive boredom that exists. I get bored very quickly, and that comes from my psychopathy, so that howling wilderness of boredom that exists, I work as hard as I do because that alleviates the boredom. I play with people because that alleviates the boredom. And I'm able, of course, to play with people because I have no conscience, I have no remorse, I have no sense of guilt. It entertains me. I have disdain for many people. In fact, the fact that I need fuel irritates me because it means that I have to interact with people. And for the most part, I'd actually prefer not to, because I see with many people, you may have caught it yesterday, I released a piece about stupidity, and that I'm able, from my distinct position, to see the many flaws with the way that people function and behave, because I see it with that crystal clear clarity that's afforded to me by my detachment. I'm not clouded by emotional judgments. I see it for what it is. And therefore, I see these various flaws, and ignorance and stupidity frustrate and annoy me because, as I mentioned in that video, I see it as a choice that people make. And unfortunately, this world is getting more and more stupid, and one can see the repercussions that arise from that. And I'm able to convey my views about that so that people understand. And interestingly, there are many people that agreed with what I was explaining. So it also allows people to, they might be slightly shocked to think, oh gosh, I agree with what a narcissistic psychopath has to say. But it is that ability to strip away the emotion because it doesn't exist for me, and to present to you very clearly, very starkly, the way that I see the world around me and the way that I regard people. So it provides you with that insight. And what I've been doing in that series is essentially taking a topic. So for example, the fading of beauty, or what I regard as beautiful and how I process it intellectually, how I regard the concept of compassion, how I regard stupidity, the way that I look upon the world, almost sort of finding a different topic and then rhapsodizing about it to enable people to understand. So it's almost like an audience with this aspect of H.G. Tudor, where it's a very intimate experience for people, so that what I wanted to create was this situation of almost, you find yourself in this obsidian castle, sleek and cold and rather intimidating. And there's this huge fireplace, and there's two armchairs, and you sit in one and I sit in the other, and there's no distractions. And then you sit and you don't talk, you just listen or read, if you will, my viewpoint, so that everything else is stripped away and you just focus on this one element. It's not a conversation, you're being treated to a monologue, but it's just a monologue where you're the only person experiencing it, so that you can fully immerse yourself in what I'm saying to you. And of course, people can provide their comments in the video or on the blog to it, but the point is, you are set to receive. I'm going to talk to you about the way that I see people, and you can't go anywhere. You can't run away. You can't close your ears. You can't close your eyes. You're going to be subjected to it. You're going to be fully immersed in that 10 minutes where I tell you all about it, so that you get that completely stripped back experience of what's going on, so that people fully understand that mindset. So where I've done that many times with the narcissism and talked about the way the world of the narcissist sees it, I'm doing it now in respect of all the aspects of the psychopathy, to enable people to truly understand the way that one's mind works. And it isn't, as I mentioned, all about running around driving rusty meat hooks through people's malformed craniums and stapling them to wooden floors, etc. It's far more than that, far more sophisticated than that also.
No, if memory serves me correct, I believe that you had said 1 in 6 people are narcissists.
That's correct.
Can you give me your estimation in terms of what percentage of the population are psychopaths?
It's far lower, so it's about 1%.
Oh.
So it's a big difference. It's a big difference. And as you rightly identify, it's 1 in 6 for narcissists. Narcissists are far more prevalent than people realize. Whereas with psychopaths, it's around about 1%.
And then what would your estimation be is the percentage of people that are narcissistic psychopaths? Much less than that even, I would assume.
That's right. Probably 0.5%, I would suggest.
Now, you had also mentioned that there are different ranges, just like there are with narcissists, in terms of you have you have a classification system, but basically where there's different components or layers that comprise the different categories for the different narcissists. And you're also saying that there exists different variations in terms of psychopaths as well, where you would have like the lower lessers that would be, let's say, in prison. Can you talk a little bit about the different classifications of the psychopathy?
Well, with the psychopathy, I haven't created a classification system in the way that I have done with narcissists, because one, with narcissists, I mentioned earlier, there are more of them, and that lends itself to there being lots of different flavors of narcissist, hence the lower, lesser, the middle range A, etc., that I've categorized. With psychopaths, it might be the case that I turn my mind to the creation of some form of classification system, but at its barest, really, it links to the issue of the executive function. So where you have a person such as I, where I have a higher executive function, that enables me to deal more effectively, for instance, with some of the impulses that I experience. Whereas somebody with their lower executive function, they give themselves away and give in to those impulses far more readily. They're also more likely to engage in criminal conduct where they get caught. And that's the difference, that most psychopaths will engage in some form of criminal conduct. Your higher echelon variety are more likely to do it in terms of white collar crime, for example, insider trading, fraudulent misrepresentation. So they would engage in behaviors in the corporate world, which are criminal activities, but would be harder to detect, harder to prove, and also, because the way the machinery works at that level, far harder to prosecute, and more likely that they will get off that behavior, because a higher echelon psychopath not only allies a higher level of intelligence with all of the other attributes of psychopathy in terms of hyperfocus, lack of conscience, etc., but also will have access to considerable resource in terms of wealth, influence, and connections. Your lower echelon psychopath doesn't have access to those things. And so where they will commit criminal acts, it is more likely to be acts of violence, sexual violence, which mean that they're invariably easier to spot, easier to detect, easier to prosecute, and it's harder for them to defend against it because often they're caught in the act and they don't have legions of expensive lawyers there to defend them. They can't create plausible deniability, whereas in a corporate structure, you can always throw somebody else under the bus to demonstrate that I didn't know, I was at the top of the tree, I wasn't aware of this. That particular vice president is the individual that has knowledge, and therefore they get thrown under the bus. It's far easier. So the main distinction really would be between the executive functions of those types of groups. And that's why many of your lower level, lower echelon psychopaths are the ones that end up committing rudimentary and base criminal actions, as I mentioned, in relation to physical and sexual violence, theft, and so forth, rather obvious and stupid behaviors. So they end up getting caught. Whereas a lot of psychopaths that have that higher executive function, people just think, for example, he's a ruthless tech titan, or she is just a particularly driven CEO. In actual fact, those individuals have been committing criminal acts left, right, and centre, but it's harder to detect because there's also that superficiality of charm, which is more effective. And of course, an individual who can't articulate himself particularly well, is toting a gun in the back of his pants, heavily tattooed, etc., and he looks like a gangbanger, then people will react in a particular way to that, and they're immediately on high alert as to that person's perhaps going to cause me a problem. Whereas somebody who comes along in the old pearl and twin set, smelling fragrantly and giving you a lovely smile, which you don't realize is reptilian in nature, and then talks in an articulate way and invites you in to a glass and chrome superstructure and starts telling you all about the good works that they've undertaken, you just think, here's a very successful person, very pleasant, very charming. And therefore people's guard goes down. What you don't realize is that you're walking straight into the spider's web, and you're going to perhaps find yourself utilized in the machinations of that individual. So that's the main distinction, really, in terms of the level of intelligence and also the executive function that exists. So it might be the case that as I expand on this work, I may break it down into categorizations, but because there are so fewer, that means that there's less opportunity to have the categorizations in the way that there has been with the narcissists.
So here's an interesting question, which is, it just kind of came to me as you were talking about that the lower functioning psychopaths would be committing more rudimentary kind of crimes. Mm-hmm. So would you estimate, therefore, then that it would be more the narcissists that are committing, let's say, the familial side, where they are killing their partners, or they're killing their wives, or they're killing their former partners, as opposed to those crimes being committed by psychopaths?
With narcissists, it's unusual for a narcissist to kill. It does happen. And it's invariably as a consequence where there has been a loss of control related to ignited fury. So you would have, let's say, a lower lesser. He has a low threshold on his ignited fury. So in those circumstances, when his control is threatened, for instance, his girlfriend says she's leaving him, he erupts with fury, which is designed to compel him to assert control over her, but he doesn't have much in the way of sophisticated manipulations. And one of the manipulations that a lower lesser would use regularly is physical violence. And so he hits her and she falls and cracks her head on the pavement and she dies. And he didn't intend to kill her, but that's what's happened. Or in a fit of ignited fury, he grabs a kitchen knife and drives it into her gut. Or in a frenzy, stabs her 87 times. That arises from the ignited fury. So the narcissist has basically lost control because of that ignited fury. And that could occur with any narcissist, but more likely to be seen with lessers because of their lower control threshold. You're less likely, although it could happen, but you're less likely to find a narcissist who would kill a stranger, for example, whereas a psychopath is more likely to do that because of the almost the curiosity versus the remove the boredom. So within the psychopathy, there's almost like, I suppose, a childlike curiosity about things. I wonder what will happen if I lift this dog up by its lead. So the psychopath lifts the dog up by the lead, and of course it starts to choke the dog, and its little doggy legs are flailing in the air. And because the psychopath has no emotional empathy and no sense of guilt for what he or she is doing, it's like, oh, look at its little legs flailing in the air. Oh, look, its face is bulging. Oh, look, that's interesting. And then the psychopath might continue until the dog is dead, or then lower the dog back down again. I wonder what it looks like if I stick a knife in somebody. So the psychopath goes and sticks a knife in somebody. So it's that almost curiosity of, and because there's no emotional empathy to place a boundary on that behavior. That's why, so the psychopath goes ahead and engages in those behaviors, and it's just the executive function that dictates. So a higher executive functioning psychopath would think, I wonder what it would look like if I sack Hank from sales now, and just on a whim does so because it's entertaining to play with Hank and to see what his reaction is to being told that he's just lost his job. Whereas a lower executive functioning psychopath may well discern, I wonder what it would look like if I smash all the windows in this house. And so just does it. Because there's that necessity. As I say, it's almost like a childlike curiosity to understand what's it like. I remember on a particular occasion where I engaged in physical violence against somebody, and the circumstances were legitimate. That's all I can say about it. But I always remember being fascinated by the sound of their ribs breaking. As that, oh, I didn't expect that to happen. And it's like, that's interesting because it alleviates the boredom by that having happened. So much of it's driven by this. For me, I have a huge intellectual curiosity of wanting to understand things, but it is linked also to removing the boredom. I wonder what would happen if I did this, so I'll just go and do it. Other people might think it, but they would never do it. So they might think, oh, I'd love to chuck this person off a cliff because they really annoy me. But you don't do it because you've got emotional empathy. You know that that's not the way that you should behave. But a psychopath could just walk up behind somebody and shove them off a cliff because there's nothing stopping this. There isn't that boundary there. And it's like, I wonder what that looks like. Oh, yeah. Oh, listen to them scream. And oh, look at them now. They're a mess at the bottom of the cliff. Hey ho, right, I'll go and get an ice cream now.
it's interesting to hear that. It's interesting to hear that perspective. Would you then therefore estimate, well, here's a better way of saying it. What would you attribute the motivation behind, let's say, serial killers? If that would be motivated from psychopathy or something else?
Well, with a serial killer, first of all, there's a flagrant disregard for the life of another human being, which therefore is supported by an absence of emotional empathy, which could be from a narcissist, could be from a psychopath. Most serial killers you would find are linked to psychopathy or are narcissistic psychopaths. So there's the wielding of power over individuals, the pursuit of that power to behave like a god by taking somebody's life. There is the alleviation of boredom. It's almost like it's something to do. And there is that urge, the impulsivity. So for some, it would be almost like a bloodlust rising, where I feel the need to go out and take a life tonight. But then, in the process of doing so, some might, because of on a whim, decide against doing it. I can't remember who it was, but there was a serial killer who was on his way to kill somebody. He just felt the need, because it was a necessity of alleviating that boredom and being able to assert power and control over people. He was on his way to kill somebody. He was looking to find a victim. And as he approached a particular house, he walked past the window and a song was playing. And he liked that song. So instead, he decided to listen to the song and then decided to go home. It stopped him going off to kill that person because he essentially decided on something else. And it is almost like that whimsy that exists in terms of deciding what ought to be done. So a lot of it with a serial killer is motivated by the assertion of that power, the assertion of that control, the alleviation of the boredom, the impulsivity that exists, a flagrant disregard for the life of other people because there's no emotional empathy. A narcissistic psychopath, I would suggest, would be more likely to torture their victims because they'd want to get a response out of them. The pure psychopath is more likely to just look at it in terms of, I wonder what happens to a human being if I hold them underwater. And look at that, I'm able to do it. How curious is this? And I have this power over this person. This is interesting. I feel powerful as I'm taking this person's life. And so much of it is driven by those factors that I have mentioned. Of course, as I said earlier on, most psychopaths don't kill. There's only a certain strand that engage in that behavior. It could also be that the psychopath has a particular fixation in relation to a certain aspect of people, which provides a sort of raison d'etre for taking those people and killing them. So, for example, you might have a serial killer who decides that, and who might be religious, who decides that prostitutes are an offense to God, and therefore, wielding their power and to get rid of the boredom, decides that they are going to rid the world of prostitutes. So they go around finding them and killing them. And they almost see it as a righteous mission. And because they have no regard for that person's life, that they wouldn't harm anybody else. They just focus on prostitutes because they have a fixation that there is something wrong and dirty about them and they are to be removed. It might be in other instances that there is a fixation with a particular color of hair or age. So that's why you see with certain serial killers, they have a specific type of victim that they go after because they have created a preoccupation with a particular facet of that individual.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because as you were saying the fixation, it made me start thinking about Ted Bundy, which
Hmm.
was a quite prolific serial killer here in the United States.
Hmm.
And a lot of I'm not sure how familiar you are with him, but a lot of his victims had resembled what some had kind of speculated was perhaps a former girlfriend,
Mm.
and that he was in essence looking for a woman that resembled her, and that
Hmm.
the victims therefore had looked like her. And it kind of just made me start thinking about like what he might have been, and it lined up with what you were saying about like the fixation on a specific kind of something or another about the person.
Yes, well, there will be an instance of developing, not all, but having a particular fixation. And it might be, for instance, that the individual caused a problem for the psychopath at some point, and therefore there's a form of revenge that's being meted out on these individuals as well. So the flexing of power and control over them. And a lot of it is essentially game playing. So that's why you will get certain psychopaths that taunt the police, sending notes saying, oh, I was watching you from the corner of such and such a street. You don't have a clue who I am. Because it's all a game. It's entertaining. That's what gives that thrill from the all-pervasive emptiness and boredom that otherwise exists. It's always seeking something. So you might get, for instance, a psychopathic lawyer who feels like he comes alive as a consequence of particularly harsh and vigorous cross-examination, combined with the penchant for snorting cocaine and meting out particularly sadistic sexual activities against prostitutes that he hires. It makes him feel alive. It removes the boredom. And that's how he gets his kicks, for want of a better description. For other people, it might be that they engage in driving on a racing circuit very fast and doing base jumping and climbing to the top of high structures without any kind of harness, because it gives a sensation of feeling alive and removes that boredom, because we are missing so much of the emotional spectrum that we almost have to fight to find a feeling. And so the extreme actions, whether it's an extreme takeover in the boardroom, embezzling money, buying a company and then tearing it apart, or meting out particularly sadistic sexual practice against somebody, or murdering somebody in a particular way, or identifying a victim and taking them off the streets and keeping them captive and torturing them before killing them. All of those things are extreme in different fields, and it's done in a way to feel, to alleviate that boredom. And that's a big driver behind our behavior.
Can you speak a little bit as to what then creates a psychopath? Because you've spoken quite in detail about the different factors that may be present in the formation of a narcissist. And I'm just wondering how it may be different and how it may be the same.
As I've explained with narcissism, there needs to be a genetic predisposition. So you have to have the capacity for the narcissism, and then you need to be exposed to a particular environment to create it. So if you like, your brain's got to be wired in a way to receive the signals. So if you liken it to a radio, you've got to be able to have the bandwidth to receive a particular set of signals for then there to be narcissism. So those two things have to come together. So there has to be a wiring of the brain, but that of itself doesn't create the narcissism. You then have to have the environment on top. With psychopathy, it's a simple formation, or lack of formation, some might say, of the way that the brain has formed and developed. So that's what originates it. And so what you'll have is an individual that is created as a psychopath. And interestingly, there have been instances of people who have suffered a brain injury later, which has essentially caused them to be a psychopath because it's affected the way that their brain has functioned. So you are essentially created as one, or whether that's from birth or as a consequence of some later brain trauma that has occurred. For instance, the usual bump on the head kind of scenario. There have been instances of people who in later life have suffered a traumatic brain injury and then have ended up behaving in exactly the way that a psychopath would do so. So it's in essence the wiring of the brain is where it comes from.
Interesting. So it's not where there's, let's say, a specific set of environmental factors and the genetic predisposition. It's completely and solely having to do with the wiring of the brain.
Yeah, I know that there are some people that argue to the contrary about that they say it's similar in the way that narcissism forms. I don't mean that they're linked as in that they're next door to one another in terms of behavior, but rather the process is similar. There are some that say that it's a genetic predisposition that is combined with environmental factors in the way that narcissism develops. So there are some people that ascribe to that view. I don't.
It's interesting. I remember you had done an interview, I believe, with a doctor in which she had shared that I'm trying to remember what it was, something to do with experimenting with narcissists, I believe, taking, was it psilocybin or was it like MDMA, and then how that would then therefore stimulate different parts of their brain where the empathy is actually located, and that there might be promising results from that. I'm really just speaking out loud in my curiosity, which would be if similar experimentation were done on psychopaths, if the same kind of results would be maybe anticipated, where it would be stimulating parts of the brain that were lying in a dormant state.
Well, I've taken MDMA in the past, and all it caused me to do is want to fuck and dance. So I didn't want to share the love, as they say. I wasn't loved up. I didn't want to start hugging people. So it didn't have that effect on me where it suddenly created empathy. And I would suggest that's because it doesn't lie dormant within me. It's just not there. So it might be the case, and I haven't analyzed any of those studies, but it might be the case that if there is a sort of untapped reservoir of empathy that's just sat there and is not accessed on a day-to-day basis, might it be that some kind of pharmaceutical can pierce the membrane to get to it? I suppose it's conceivable, but that presupposes that the empathy is there to begin with. If it's not, you can't inject empathy into someone who hasn't got it.
I think that's really fascinating. I think you also just sharing your experience of what it had been like and what it did not activate in you, because I know a great number of people who do partake in MDMA have shared, it's kind of like called the love drug, because it makes everybody feel connected and loving towards one another, and that you did not have that experience. And I think that's really fascinating.
Well, it's interesting because I do know about the experiments that have taken place with veterans that have post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, the problem that they've hitherto had is that the therapeutic approach has been to try and talk to them about what they experienced, which of course forces them to relive it, which then triggers them and therefore revisits what they've experienced and brings on all the various symptoms. So what they looked at doing was saying, is there any way that we can sort of detach the symptoms for a period of time so that they can talk about what they've experienced without actually reliving it emotionally, but just talk about the experience to enable them to process it and understand it. And in these experiments, they utilized MDMA, and they found that in doing so, and it was done in a clinical environment where proper pure amounts were utilized in a particular dosage, that there was a doctor and a psychologist with them, etc. They were monitored for heart rate and blood pressure and all the rest of it. So they were properly looked after. And that once it had been administered, that acted to detach the emotional symptoms that were surrounding the post-traumatic stress disorder. It was almost like unhooking a caravan and letting it float away from your vehicle. And then they were able to talk about what they'd experienced, free of the flashbacks, free of the emotional baggage, if one can describe it that way. And therefore they were able to actually process for once what they'd experienced, understand the impact that it had upon them, perhaps learn coping mechanisms. And astonishingly, thereafter, the success rate was phenomenal in terms of either the eradication of their post-traumatic stress disorder or a significant reduction. And I saw a bit of footage with one of the veterans explaining, you know, if he was saying, if I went out on a parade and fireworks went off, immediately the bangs would thrust me back into a combat situation. So I couldn't be in those environments. If a helicopter came overhead, I immediately was thrust back into that combat situation. And then since going through this process, he found that he was able to experience those things with no flashback, no return to that combat situation. It was quite astonishing. Now, of course, that's different from the question of empathy, but he evidently had empathy. And it might be, of course, that when he's experiencing these flashbacks and going back into those situations, his emotional empathy becomes reduced. So he's aggressive towards people. It was causing problems in his relationships, etc. He couldn't hold down a job and so forth. But it was interesting to see how the application of that particular pharmaceutical had proven so effective in enabling the processing of what had gone on. And I think by extension, there is the suggestion to say that, of course, when you're talking about a narcissist, that some narcissists, not all, but some narcissists, of course, are created as a consequence of that genetic predisposition and being exposed to some form of trauma. Now, not all narcissists are, because some narcissists' lack of control environment might come from, say, the grade B syndrome that I was talking about for me earlier on, which isn't, you wouldn't describe that as traumatic. It's just problematic with regard to the issue of control. And some narcissists are created from being in a gilded environment, you know, the proverbial silver spoon, whereas others are created from physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and so forth, witnessing a traumatic event, you know, the murder of their parents, for example. So by extension, there's a suggestion that if the narcissism formed as a consequence of a reaction to a genetic predisposition allied with a lack of control environment, might it then enable some kind of processing to take place, which could then have similar results to that occurred for post-traumatic stress disorder? Who knows? The difference I see is that, of course, the narcissism protects itself. So where you're a veteran that's got post-traumatic stress disorder, you are essentially going to say, please make this go away. So you're going to be open to treatment. The narcissist doesn't see that there's anything wrong with them. So if you try to say to the narcissist, come and do this treatment, their narcissism will automatically defend against it by saying, no, you're affecting my control by trying to make me do something. I'm not going to go along with it. So the problem you would have is that it would be very difficult to get a narcissist to go along with that, because the suggestion is a threat to control and their narcissism will automatically defend them against it.
That's a fantastic differentiation. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Just like you can identify other narcissists, do you have the same kind of experience where you're able to easily identify other psychopaths?
I am able, after spending a bit of time with an individual, to recognize one of my kind who's a psychopath as well. Yes. albeit, of course, they're far rarer, so the opportunity for that to happen is much more limited.
Can you speak a little bit more about the psychopathic perspective on playing with your, I want to say on the one hand toys, but I also want to say on the other hand appliances. So however you want to answer it, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your perspective on that.
Certainly. Well, people are objects. They're just there to be utilized. And from a psychopathic perspective, rather, they are there just to amuse. So people will either facilitate a goal or they'll get in the way of the goal. So if they're there to facilitate it, they'll be used. So one might treat them well by being charming and entertaining to them because one recognizes the value that they can provide in enabling the achievement of a particular goal that one has. Alternatively, if they're going to get in the way, then they have to be removed. But the point is they are just simply part of the transaction. Now, sometimes the individual is the goal itself, because one decides, as I was alluding to earlier on, I wonder what would happen if I do this to this person. So it might be, for instance, looking at a woman and thinking, she's particularly pretty. I wonder what she looks like when she cries. So I'll go, so then the next thing is make her cry. And then that curiosity is satisfied. Oh, look, face has gone all blotchy, and look at that. Look at the way that her eyes have gone particularly red as she cries, and that luscious mouth now doesn't look anywhere near as appealing when it's sort of twisted in that weird mewling shape. She's making that strange noise. So in certain instances, the individual is the goal, and again, one toys with that person because there is nothing to stop that happening, and my needs come above everything else. In other instances, it might be, I wonder how that person would react if I was to give them some good news. So it's not always about doing bad things to people. It can, in other instances, be, right, I'm now going to go and give that person a large sum of money because I want to see how they react. And it's not about the goodness of the act, because there isn't any goodness that exists, but rather that'll be interesting to see what their response to it is. And of course, one can't lose sight as well of the fact that I'm a hybrid. So if, for example, if I was to decide to give someone a large sum of money, their reaction provides me with fuel as well. So I'm hitting two bases. The intellectual curiosity as to how that person would respond in those circumstances, and the removal of boredom by I'm doing something where it's godlike in effect. It's descending from the heavens and saying, I am going to influence this person's life for good or for bad, because I want to be able to wield that power. The narcissist in me wants to receive the fuel that originates from their reaction to what I'm doing. I want to remove the boredom by having somebody to play with, and I'm curious as to how they respond, because I have always learned from the way that other people respond, and then I log their reaction so that either, oh, that was interesting, I'm stimulated, or, and, oh, so that's how somebody reacts when they're upset. Right, I can use that in the future. Oh, so that's what somebody looks like when they're concerned. Right, I can use that for the future. That's the sort of the imitation game that I've spoken about in that particular video.
Can you
But for the most part,
sorry, go ahead.
So yeah, for the most part, it is about the necessity of being able to use people, because that's what people are there to satisfy what I require, be it fuel on the narcissistic side, control, which is on both sides, amusement, entertainment, the removal of the boredom on the psychopathic side. But people are those objects, and there is that unrelenting desire to own people, to make them my possessions, because it amuses me and entertains me. It's almost like a challenge. Go into a bar, choose that woman, can I pull her? Yeah, and the task of doing so provides some entertainment. Just sitting at a bar having a drink, that's boring. But seeing if I can make her mine, that's far more entertaining.
So this brings up the question about relationships and what kind of relationships psychopaths have, both friendships and romantic.
Relationships are there again as just a transaction for people to be used. Relationships can readily occur. Certain psychopaths, they remove themselves from people, only sort of dipping into the world as and when is required. Others, because of that superficiality of charm and the glibness, etc., that goes with it, could have a wide circle of friends and have a romantic relationship, and therefore interact quite readily with those individuals because they serve a purpose with regard to providing stimulation. But they are, again, either they are the goal or they are a means of getting to the goal. That's all that they are there for. So it's not the case that the psychopath is always going to be beating up their partner. It might be that that individual provides them with sufficient stimulation and that they seek what they want elsewhere. So they stimulate them in one respect because they're an interesting person to talk to, and the narcissist alleviates boredom by creeping out at night and going off and slaughtering cows in fields or whatever it might be. But a psychopath can have what can be ostensibly, to the outside world at least, a productive relationship. But there'll be obviously signs there in terms of the absence of emotional empathy, the distance that exists. In some people pick up upon the emptiness, because one of the distinctions as well that exists between the narcissist and the psychopath is that the narcissist is essentially always fighting against the emptiness within, trying to fill it with fuel, whereas the psychopath wants to alleviate the boredom, but accepts the emptiness as part of what they are. Don't fight against it. That's just the way that they are. And often there are certain people who are particularly attuned to other individuals, i.e. empathic individuals, who will say that they can pick up on that emptiness. They feel the emptiness of the psychopath. So whilst I recognize them for different reasons, there are other people that may be able to detect them because they literally feel the chasm, the void, the abyss.
That brings me to the next question, which is, what are some things that a person could look out for if they wanted to shield themselves against becoming ensnared by a psychopath?
But it goes to looking for those behaviors in terms of the individual. There is no connection. So you will often find that you may have that gut reaction to, they're talking to me, but I don't really feel any connection, that you find that they are particularly charming, but you recognize that it's only a superficial interest in you that's taking place, that the individual may not spend a lot of time because they move on to something else, that they do exhibit symptoms of boredom very quickly, so that they need to then alleviate that. So you may find that the individual doesn't talk to you for long and then has moved on to talking to somebody else. There may also be the impulsivity that you witness in terms of the narcissist suddenly does something which is a little bit unusual because they can't help themselves. So for instance, you may ostensibly be with this person who's well-dressed and well-spoken, and then you go outside and they've stolen a glass from the restaurant that you've been in. And so, why did you do that? Oh, I just couldn't help myself. And then it happens again. So that impulsivity might be a suggestion as you're dealing with the psychopath. The lack of understanding and response in some instances to the way that where you're perhaps upset, where something's troubling you, that you don't get a response that you would expect in terms of being comforted, that you're almost met with this cold, not unpleasant, not nasty, but there's just simply nothing there. And a lot of it can occur where if you look into the psychopath's eyes and you're met with nothing. There are many instances where they actually do take the time to bother to look carefully, that they will then come across that emptiness. So those are some of the things that might be picked up upon.
You're reminding me, when I was in high school, we had found out one of our teachers had died. And I remember we were sitting around in the classroom talking about it. And a lot of us were very, kind of like shaken by the experience. And then there was one girl who was sitting there and she was just like completely unfazed, couldn't care less, was changing the subject, talking about other things. We were all kind of like looking over like, does she not have a heart? Does she not have a soul? It was
yes,
very, very
that's something.
dark.
Yeah, the psychopath, of course, can mimic, so that enables the psychopath to fit in. But there'll be instances where there's almost this sort of shrug of the shoulders to what's happened, and you think that's a bit of a strange reaction. And often people just put it down to, oh well, everybody deals with grief in different ways, etc. When in actual fact, that person just has no interest in it because there's no emotional connection, there's no emotional empathy. So you often see that the individual doesn't react in a similar way. So that's a good example where the individual isn't reacting in the way that everybody else is, that they're not exhibiting any fear or anxiety, and it can also be identified where that individual might act with considerable bravery. And that's what you think that it is. But in actual fact, it's born out of the absence of fear and anxiety. So they're able in a situation. So for instance, that you're in a store and somebody pulls out a gun and this person just walks over and tackles them as if they were, removing a speck of fluff from their lapel. And you think, gosh, you were cool as a cucumber there. And again, that may well be demonstrating what you're dealing with, because not only is that interesting for the psychopath to deal with, here's some excitement, but also the manner in which they do it. There's no anxiety associated with it. There's no skittishness that occurs. So again, that could be an indicator. So you'd be looking at an individual that has the sort of, the adrenaline junkie, the various pursuits which are there to alleviate the boredom and seek a thrill, but also individuals who are remarkably cool under pressure in situations where everybody else is losing their shit. They're not, and they're not reacting like everybody else is. They almost seem like they've slowed down. They're in slow motion because they're still calm in relation to what's going on.
That's a very interesting differentiation. I definitely appreciate that. Because on the one hand, we would look at it like, well, there's really like, what the fuck? Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, it's very, very jarring to kind of have that interaction, but then how there's actually like, you can see how there's benefits to it as well. It allows them to rise in whatever field they're actually in because of it.
That's right. I mean, as I was explaining earlier on, the reason why I'm able to do so much of what I do in terms of output is linked to the hyperfocus that's associated with my psychopathy, that I'm not distracted by the emotions that take place, but also many of the things that I do professionally, my psychopathy is particularly well equipped because I am in situations where essentially keeping a cool head is paramount, and not being frightened, not becoming anxious, not getting nervous. All of those are particularly useful for what I do. There was a time, I think it was during the 1970s, that the British government considered that in their planning for a nuclear war, that when they were looking at what to do with society thereafter, it was suggested that psychopaths be put in charge of various tasks, almost like regional governors, because it was felt that they would deal best with the horror following a nuclear attack, that they wouldn't be as fazed by all the death and destruction as other people would, that they wouldn't be traumatized by it, and therefore they would be best placed to function. And there is a logic to that. But the problem that you then have, of course, is that the psychopath would be entirely self-serving, so that any resources that would exist, the psychopath would take them for themselves or allocate them to people that they viewed favorably, and wouldn't necessarily dole them out to the people that needed them most. That indeed, a psychopath would probably adopt, logically, a very useful triage system of basically looking at somebody and thinking, you're not going to survive, so I'm now going to put you out of your misery. And so whilst there's an upside to putting a psychopath in such a role, because they would be not fazed by what they're seeing around them, and therefore much better placed to respond, they wouldn't be in a trauma situation. The difficulty is the other aspects of their psychopathy, the self-serving aspect, the necessity of playing with people and so forth, would then mean that there'd be a considerable downside to it at all. So in the end, it was decided that they wouldn't do that. But it was an interesting notion.
Now, you had shared in the past that dating apps are kind of like prime breeding ground for narcissists, right? Would
Yes.
you say the same would be true for psychopaths to be on them, also to alleviate the boredom?
Yes, again, an environment which provides a toy box is going to be particularly appealing.
Be right back while I go and shut down my dating app. Oh my
Very
God.
sensible. You should get rid of that post haste.
I was like, I'm going to give myself a month. I think I've been on it 2 days. I'm like, this doesn't feel like it's really the right idea.
No,
and I'm
no,
always
go
hearing
and
the HD voice bouncing around in the back of my head, like this is prime breeding ground.
Good.
Like, no better.
Good, absolutely, Faye. Well, I would encourage you to go and meet people in the real world rather than using dating apps. As my video explains why you should not use online dating. It really, not only is it a playground for narcissists and psychopaths, you're far more likely to come across a narcissist, however. Your chances of being ensnared by a psychopath really are low. But there's a whole other raft of things that are wrong with it, as I explained in the video. So get rid of it, and just you're an attractive and intelligent woman and articulate. You'll easily find somebody in the real world, so go and do that instead.
I know you are very private about your identity, but if you ever find yourself on the West Coast, please look me up.
I will take that as an open invitation.
I don't travel much, so I think the likelihood of me ending up in England is far, far slimmer, but.
Oh, well, it looks like I'll have to come to you then.
I'm very discreet. People have referred to me as the Vault, so if I ever met you, I would.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know.
I want to just think if I have any additional questions that I was thinking about. Is there anything else specifically that you would, oh, yes, here's another question. You have fantastic series on, notable and famous narcissists. And although the percentage is much lower for psychopaths, could you see yourself perhaps doing a series in which you would be exploring notable or famous psychopaths?
I have, when I've undertaken, as I call it, the Tudor scope, when I put people to the examination, the bulk is looking at, is this person a narcissist? Is there, or is this person a normal, an empath, or narcissistic? Those are the categorizations. But if somebody is a psychopath, I will include that as well. And without giving it away, because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't watched the videos so far, I think there have been at least 2 instances where I've identified narcissistic psychopaths. So where it exists, I include it. That's certainly something that I'll continue to do. There are other famous ones that are out there. So where they fall to be examined by the Tudor scope and they are a psychopath, then that will be included. Generally speaking, you're going to find with many of the more famous ones, they're more likely to be a narcissistic psychopath. As mentioned on other occasions, Faye, psychopaths always have narcissistic traits, but they're not necessarily narcissists as well. But they'll always have some narcissistic traits because everybody has them. And they may well have fairly strong ones, even if it doesn't make them a narcissist, i.e. they don't need fuel, for example. With regard to identifying pure psychopaths who are famous, that's probably more difficult, because a lot of the pure psychopaths you would find wouldn't necessarily be as well known, and you probably find more of those in the criminal fraternity. So there would be some, and perhaps it would be a case more of me having to go into the true crime environment to identify some of those, and that might be more for you're very much a niche area of people who are interested in serial killers or true crime, etc., because a lot of people might not have heard about them. And of course, what I have to keep in mind is that I put a lot of work into these analyses, and at the end of the day, it's got to be worth it for me to do it in terms of views. So I've got to balance that as well. So whilst there are some people who, amongst my viewers, Faye, there are some people come up with some really interesting suggestions, and I very much appreciate them doing so. But often, of course, I don't think that person is prominent enough to get the interest. And so, unfortunately, it's not something that I can look at, because I just don't have the time to dedicate to doing that person if they're not going to get lots of people necessarily, or a substantial number of people watching. But certainly with the narcissistic psychopaths, they're more likely to appear. So where they do, so I don't think I would do a separate series about notable psychopaths. I think I would just include them with the ongoing analyses that I do of putting people under the Tudor scope, and where a psychopath comes along, if they are one, they'll be revealed as such as part of that analysis.
Fair enough. I did actually see, and again, I'm a vault, so I'm not going to share who, but I definitely saw one of the ones in which you had uncovered. It was one of the recent ones that you had uncovered, the narcissistic psychopath, which was very, very fascinating. Kind of surprising, but also kind of not surprising simultaneously. And anyone who's watching this, I'm going to encourage you, if you don't already subscribe to HG's channel, head over there. I'm going to include all of your links down below. Your videos are fantastic. They're eye-opening, they're informative, they are absolutely remarkable. And even though I know you say that you're doing this work for the fulfillment of your legacy and for the prime aims, you know you're helping a lot of people, right?
Absolutely. My work works, and it is a side effect, if you will, of what I do. But at the same token, it segues neatly into the achievement of the prime aims. So doing all of this, as I say, essentially keeps me busy and alleviates the boredom, but also part of this is the creation of my legacy. And therefore, by providing information that helps people, they are more likely then to go and recommend it to somebody else, which then builds that legacy. So the point is that by providing content, which is both informative, insightful, educational, and entertaining, not only do I gain the prime aims, but it really does cater to that issue of the extension of a legacy, because people are given the freedom that they rightly deserve. The testimonials that I receive, Faye, bear testament to all of that. And the fact is that my work saves lives, my work saves livelihoods, my work enables people to get free of what they were dealing with. And because people get those things, they're eternally grateful to me, which means that they become an advocate for my work, so that they will go and say to other people, this guy's work's brilliant, you need to watch it. And when they know of somebody who's got a problem, they advocate my work to them, which brings in more people and thus extends the legacy. So whilst I don't do it specifically to help people, because of course of what I am, I'm not about helping people for the sake of helping people. I help people because it caters to what I want, and therefore it's a win-win.
It is a win. I know you say it. I still kind of have trouble with it, because it is rather remarkable to meet somebody who is so self-serving, but at the same time is actually transforming lives and helping people get on the other side of really, really bad situations. So I laugh about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at a lot of people who help people, you actually realize that much of it is self-serving. And a lot, in many instances, you would end up thinking, well, what do I care? that person isn't harming me, and they're enriching my life in some way, providing me with technology, new cars, entertaining me, whatever it might be. If you don't have to live with that individual, life's sweet. And so many of our kind, of course, cause problems around the world with the creation of conflict and war and so forth. But also many of our kind create brilliant things, art, technology, films, books, etc., which enrich people's lives. Of course, there's some unfortunate somewhere who'll be getting devalued and abused somewhere. But if you were to look at it in purely utilitarian terms, you'd say this person has created a brilliant series that millions of people have enjoyed. You know, they've got 20 intimate partner primary sources during their life who've been given a really tough old time. In general terms, you would actually say, well, is that not a sacrifice that's worth having so that millions of people have been enriched through an entertaining series? And the answer is you would say so.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Is there any last words that you'd like to leave us with that pertain either to psychopathy or to narcissism or the intersection of both?
I would say that if you want to understand more about that, then you're in no better place than to access my work, because not only is it a huge vault of material that's wide and deep, but also it's put in terms that are readily understandable. I don't use esoteric scientific or psychological terms because I'm neither of those things. And that's what makes my work so useful, is that I explain it in a way that is relatable to people. So if you want to understand more about narcissism and psychopathy, or the intersection of those two, as you pointed out, Faye, then access the various platforms that Faye's very kindly going to indicate below, on YouTube and Facebook and my blog, etc., and the Knowledge Vault. And then you can gain understanding to help you if you find yourself in the situation that you're ensnared by one of my kind, or if you're interested in this as a topic in itself. You'll find it fascinating, understanding more about the way that my kind see the world, and of course, the way that the ultra, me, sees the world.
I think also if somebody just wants to be entertained, because you're actually very entertaining as well. It's informative
Yes.
and entertaining. Like you had said with Harry's wife, it's very, very funny. It's actually it's funny and sad, because when you understand actually that she's a narcissist and the damage and harm that she's causing, but it's a very entertaining series. And
well, you have to laugh at her because she's such a comedic loser that and also because she's actually such a beige individual, I have to take the piss out of her in order just to tolerate talking about her. But I do stand by the fact that if people are entertained while they're educated, they're more likely to listen to you and it's more likely to stick. So that's one of my sort of mantras, is about educational entertainment, rather than droning on in very dry academic terms where people are saying, oh, well, yeah, that's all very well, and they probably does know what he's talking about, but I don't really understand it and it's boring. I have the advantage of a wicked sense of humor allied with my wonderful chocolatey velvety tones, which all come together as a confluence of ensuring that people are entertained. So it's all good news.
And you have a remarkable vocabulary as well.
Thank you very much.
HT, would you be willing to come back and to do a third interview in which we can explore topics pertaining to empaths?
Absolutely, Faye, it'd be my pleasure. So we can just arrange that.
Thank you. And I'm also going to encourage anybody, this is probably the best money that I have ever spent, which I had actually done your empath detector. It's from, I don't understand how you did it. I don't know if there's like some sorcery or if there's like some magical spell or whatever. I don't understand how you did it, but the way in which from a questionnaire, you are actually able to narrow down and ascertain the kind of empath that somebody is freaky. It's freaky. I felt validated. I felt seen. I felt understood. It was wild. And then also just the extra tip that you add, in which we are then empowered in understanding what kind of narc are we then most likely to attract because of the kind of empath that we are. I
Yeah.
can't say
Well,
enough good about
thank you. I'm pleased that that was useful for you, though I'm not surprised. And the way that it works is that I walk Withershins 3 times around a lightning blasted oak, and that imbues me with the insight and power to tell you what type of empath you are. So you're right, it's all sorcery based.
It surprises me not one bit. No, but really, could you share how in the world do you establish that? It's wild.
It's done as a consequence of a lot of work that went into identifying the questions that link to the relevant responses that draw out the appropriate traits to demonstrate, A, is somebody an empath to begin with, or are they something else? And then if they are an empath, to determine the types and the answers, or have a particular value that works in isolation, but also in tandem as well. So it's a very complicated algorithm that brings it all together. And that's why it provides such detailed insight for people and demonstrates such a level of accuracy as well. So a lot of work went into it to formulate the way that it functions. So it's not just the roll of a dice, there's far more to it.
It's wildly accurate. And thank you for creating it. And thank you for agreeing to come back on again and to speak with my audience. This has been a pleasure. I really, really enjoy speaking with you. And you are always so insightful and so well-spoken and just a wealth of information and knowledge. And I'm really going to encourage anybody and everybody to please check out HG. I'm going to put all of his links down below. You will not be bored, you will be educated, and you will learn a lot, and you will enjoy it as well. And thank you again, HG. I truly appreciate this.
Not at all. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you again.